In the dust-choked borderlands of Dakota Territory, where desperate times call for desperate measures, a county auction is about to change two lives forever. Eliza Boone, a weathered spinster with calloused hands and a failing farm, sits among the crowd as men are sold like cattle to pay their debts. Most lots draw eager bidders, but when they drag out Lot 17, a towering figure, with a bloodied burlap sack over his head, the crowd falls silent. Nobody wants the man they say killed a marshal with his bare hands. Nobody except Eliza, who offers her last $2 out of pity. She brings him home, expecting nothing more than help with her dying well. But when the sun sets and the stranger finally removes his sack, he speaks one word that stops her heart: Jonah. Could this silent giant be the legendary protector who saved her life 10 years ago, then vanished like smoke? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth of Eliza Boone's homestead, where hope had withered like the wheat stalks in her fields. At 32, she wore the lines of hardship like badges of honor, each crease around her grey eyes, telling stories of seasons that had tested her resolve. Her hands, rough as sandpaper from years of mending what couldn't be fixed and fixing what shouldn't have broken, moved with practiced efficiency as she gathered eggs from the 3 hens that remained of what had once been a thriving coop. The well stone sat like a monument to her failures in the center of the yard, its rope frayed and useless, the bucket long since fallen into the depths where no water had flowed for 18 months. Every morning she stared at it, remembering when her father had first struck water here, when her mother had drawn buckets full of sweet, cold relief. Now it mocked her with its silence, a dry throat in a dying land. Dakota Territory in 1876 was not kind to women alone, and Eliza had learned that lesson with the brutal efficiency of a slap across the face. When the drought came 3 years back, it had taken the neighboring families first, the Hendersons to the east, the Millers to the north, all packed up and headed back to whatever civilization they'd left behind. The strong survived, the weak moved on, and somewhere in between sat Eliza, too stubborn to leave and too proud to admit defeat. She had been 12 when the world first showed her its teeth. The memory lived in her bones like an old ache, surfacing on days when the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Her parents had joined a wagon train heading west, chasing the promise of gold and good soil, carrying their daughter's dreams in a canvas-covered wagon that creaked with hope. She remembered the morning they'd broken camp near Silver Creek, how her mother had hummed while kneading biscuit dough, how her father had whistled as he hitched the oxen. The attack had come with the sun barely above the horizon, a thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of rifles that shattered the morning peace. Bandits, desperate and cruel, had fallen upon the wagon train like wolves on wounded deer. In the chaos, Eliza had watched her parents fall, had seen the other families scattered like leaves in a storm. She had run, her small legs carrying her toward the creek, toward anywhere that might offer shelter from the nightmare unfolding behind her. That was when he had appeared. Even now, 20 years later, the memory remained crystalline in its clarity. A tall figure on horseback, moving through the smoke and confusion, with the calm certainty of a man who had seen hell and made peace with it. His face had been shadowed by his hat, but his hands had been gentle as he'd lifted her from where she'd fallen by the creek bank. He'd spoken to her in a voice like distant thunder, telling her she was safe, that he would get her to the other survivors. "What's your name, little one?" he had asked as he'd carried her across the creek, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "Eliza," she had whispered, still shaking from the terror of watching her world end. "Eliza," he had repeated, and somehow the way he said it had made her feel like maybe the world wasn't ending after all. "You're going to be just fine, Eliza. I promise you that." He had gathered the surviving children, 7 orphans from 5 families, and had led them to the nearest town, riding through the night with a gentleness that belied the guns on his hips and the hardness in his eyes. When they'd reached civilization, he had stayed only long enough to ensure they were placed with families, then had vanished like smoke in the wind. She had asked about him, begged the townspeople to tell her his name, but he had become legend, even as the dust settled from his departure. Some called him the Ghost Rider. Others whispered about the man who appeared when hope was lost and disappeared when safety was found. But one old-timer at the general store had leaned close and whispered a single word: Jonah. The name had followed her through the years, a talisman against the darkness that had tried to claim her that terrible morning. When she'd married Thomas Boone at 19, she had told him the story. When Thomas had died 2 years later, kicked by a horse and buried in ground too hard to properly dig, she had whispered the name like a prayer. When the drought came and the well ran dry, when neighbors moved away and creditors came calling, she had held onto the memory of gentle hands and a voice that had promised everything would be just fine. Now, standing in her failing yard, with the sun climbing toward another day of cloudless sky, Eliza wondered if she had been foolish to hold on to such memories. The county was talking about a debtor's auction, a cruel practice that had started in the eastern territories and was spreading west like a disease. Men who couldn't pay their debts were put up for auction like livestock, sold to whoever would pay their obligations in exchange for a period of indentured service. The thought made her stomach turn, but she understood the desperation that drove such measures. She had exactly $2.17 to her name, hardly enough to keep body and soul together for another month. The bank had been patient, but patience had its limits, and she could see the end approaching like a storm on the horizon. Her nearest neighbor, Martha Kellerman, had ridden over the evening before with news that the auction would be held in 3 days' time. Martha was a practical woman, widowed like Eliza, but blessed with better soil and a well that still gave water. She had viewed the auction with the cold eye of someone who saw opportunity in others' misfortune. "There'll be good workers to be had," Martha had said, settling her considerable bulk into Eliza's only good chair. "Men who know the land, who can put in a full day's work without complaint, might be just what you need to get this place back on its feet." Eliza had nodded, knowing Martha was right, but feeling the wrongness of it in her bones. Men weren't meant to be bought and sold like cattle, no matter how desperate their circumstances. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling where the roof leaked in 3 places, she had allowed herself to imagine having help with the heavy work, someone to fix the well and mend the fences. The morning of the auction dawned clear and hot, with the kind of merciless sun that seemed to draw moisture from everything it touched. Eliza had debated staying home, but curiosity and a desperate hope for some solution to her problems had driven her to hitch up her old mare and make the journey to town. The courthouse square was more crowded than she had seen it in years, filled with farmers and ranchers, business owners and land speculators, all gathered to witness the spectacle of human misery dressed up as commerce. A wooden platform had been erected in front of the courthouse steps, and a portly man in a too-tight suit was testing the strength of a wooden podium with his fists. Eliza tied her mare to the hitching post and made her way through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces and avoiding the eyes of those who had been whispering about her own precarious situation. She found a spot near the back where she could observe without drawing attention, her $2 clutched in her damp palm like a talisman. The auctioneer, a man named Bixby who dealt in livestock and farm equipment, called for attention with the ringing of a large bell. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather here today in the spirit of Christian charity and practical commerce. The men you will see offered for honest work have fallen upon hard times through no fault of their own. They seek only the opportunity to work off their debts with dignity and purpose." The crowd murmured approval, but Eliza heard the undercurrent of excitement that came with the prospect of acquiring cheap labor. She watched as the first lot was brought forward, a young man with soft hands and the look of someone who had never done a day's physical labor in his life. He went for $12 to a rancher who needed help with bookkeeping. The morning progressed with a steady parade of human misery. Farmers who had lost their crops, shopkeepers who had extended too much credit, craftsmen whose skills had been made obsolete by progress. Each man climbed the platform with what dignity he could muster, their faces a mixture of shame and resignation. Most sold quickly, their particular skills or strong backs making them valuable to the assembled buyers. But as the lots grew higher in number, the quality of the merchandise seemed to decline. The men who came later were older, harder, marked by lives that had taken more than they had given. It was well past noon when they brought out Lot 17, and the change in the crowd was immediate and palpable. A hush fell over the assembly as two sheriff's deputies led a figure onto the platform, a man so tall he had to duck slightly to clear the beam that supported the courthouse awning. He was massive, broader through the shoulders than any man Eliza had ever seen, but it was not his size that caught her attention. It was the burlap sack that covered his head, tied around his neck with rough rope and stained with what looked like dried blood. His hands were shackled behind his back, and his clothes were torn and dirty, as if he had been sleeping rough for weeks. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle of the mysterious figure, but Eliza noticed how they maintained their distance, as if proximity to this man might somehow contaminate them. Whispers rippled through the assembly like wind through grain. "That's the one they say killed Marshal Davidson down in Deadwood. Beat him to death with his bare hands, I heard. They say he don't speak. Hasn't said a word since they brought him in. Cursed, that's what he is, cursed and dangerous." Bixby seemed nervous as he approached the podium, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, despite the shade provided by the courthouse awning. "Lot 17, he announced, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried all morning. "Strong back, experience with horses and cattle. Starting bid is $5. The silence stretched like a taut wire. No hands raised, no voices called out bids. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for someone else to make the first move. "Come now, gentlemen," Bixby tried again, his voice climbing with desperation. "Look at the size of him, worth $5 for his labor alone." Still nothing. The man on the platform stood motionless, his head cocked slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. The bloodied sack stirred gently in the breeze, and Eliza found herself wondering what kind of face it concealed. $3, Bixby offered, his voice now pleading. "Surely someone can use a strong back for $3. The silence continued, broken only by the distant sound of a dog barking and the creak of the platform under the big man's weight. Eliza felt something twist in her chest, a sympathy she couldn't quite name for this silent figure who stood like a monument to human suffering. $2, Bixby called out, his voice cracking with desperation. $2 for Lot 17. And that was when Eliza's hand rose, seemingly of its own accord, her voice carrying across the silent crowd like a bell in the wilderness. "Here," she said, her words cutting through the stillness. $2. The crowd turned to stare at her, their faces a mixture of surprise and concern. She heard Martha Kellerman gasp behind her, heard someone whisper about poor Eliza finally losing her mind. But she kept her hand raised, her eyes fixed on the silent figure on the platform. Bixby looked around desperately, hoping for another bid, any bid that might save him from the embarrassment of selling a man for $2. But the crowd remained silent, their collective fear of the mysterious Lot 17 stronger than their desire for cheap labor. $2, Bixby said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Going once, going twice." He paused, looking around one last time. "Sold to Miss Boone for $2. The crowd began to disperse immediately, as if they couldn't get away from the spectacle fast enough. The deputies unlocked the shackles and handed Eliza a paper documenting her purchase, their faces grim with the unspoken warning that she had just bought herself a world of trouble. She led her new acquisition to her wagon, helping him climb into the back with surprising gentleness. He moved carefully, as if every step caused him pain, and she noticed the way he favored his left side. The burlap sack remained firmly in place, and she made no move to remove it, sensing that such an action would constitute a violation of whatever privacy he had left. The ride back to her homestead passed in silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of her mare's hooves. She found herself stealing glances at her passenger, trying to read something in his posture, in the way he held his massive frame so carefully still. When they reached her farm, she helped him down from the wagon and led him to the barn, where she had prepared a makeshift bed in one of the empty stalls. She showed him the well, the broken fences, the dozen tasks that needed doing around the place. He nodded at each instruction, his head moving with deliberate precision under the concealing sack. "There's food in the house when you're hungry," she said, her voice sounding strange in the stillness of the evening. "And if you need anything." She trailed off, realizing the absurdity of the offer. What could she possibly provide for this man that would matter? What comfort could she offer to someone who had been reduced to a commodity at auction? As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza found herself standing in her doorway, watching the barn where her $2 purchase had taken refuge. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, whether she had made a terrible mistake or simply delayed the inevitable collapse of her small world. It was then that she saw him emerge from the barn, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying light. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, walking to the edge of her property, where the land fell away toward the distant hills. For a long moment he stood there, perfectly still, as if communing with the vast emptiness that surrounded them. Then, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their deliberateness, he reached up and began to untie the rope that held the burlap sack in place. Eliza held her breath, suddenly aware that she was about to witness something profound, something that would change the course of her life forever. The sack fell away, and even in the fading light, she could see the outline of his profile, the strong jaw, and the way he held his head with quiet dignity. He turned then, as if sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the distance that separated them. His voice, when it came, was like distant thunder, rich and deep and filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. "Jonah," he said, the single word carrying the weight of 20 years of silence. And in that moment, Eliza Boone knew that her $2 had purchased far more than a strong back and willing hands. She had bought herself a piece of her own history, a fragment of the past that had shaped her into the woman she had become. The man who had saved her life as a child had returned to her as an adult, broken and silent, and carrying secrets that would either redeem them both or destroy whatever small piece she had managed to carve from the unforgiving Dakota soil. The paddle in Eliza's trembling hand felt heavier than iron as she stood in the courthouse square, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The auction had transformed from mere spectacle into something that would haunt her dreams, the sight of desperate men sold like livestock, their dignity stripped away along with their freedom. But it was Lot 17 that had broken something inside her chest, this silent giant who stood motionless under his bloodied shroud, while the crowd whispered their fears like prayers to a vengeful God. Sheriff Carmichael had pulled her aside after the sale, his weathered face creased with concern that went beyond professional duty. "Miss Boone, you sure you know what you're doing? That man's got a reputation that'd make the devil himself think twice." "What kind of reputation?" she had asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "Killed 3 men down in Deadwood, they say. Beat Marshal Davidson to death with nothing but his hands. They found him standing over the body, covered in blood, wouldn't say a word in his own defense." Carmichael's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some folks think he ain't right in the head. Others say he's cursed. Either way, he's dangerous." But as Eliza watched Jonah, she couldn't think of him as Lot 17 anymore. Climbed carefully into her wagon. She saw none of the violence the sheriff described. His movements were deliberate, almost gentle, like a man afraid his own strength might break something precious. The way he positioned himself in the wagon bed, making himself as small as possible despite his massive frame, spoke of someone trying not to take up more space than necessary. The ride home stretched like a taut wire between them, silence broken only by the rhythmic creaking of wagon wheels and the soft clip of her mare's hooves on the packed earth road. Every few minutes, Eliza found herself stealing glances at her passenger, trying to reconcile the terrifying reputation with the quiet figure who sat with his head bowed, hands folded carefully in his lap. When they reached her property, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the cracked earth in shades of amber and gold. She helped him down from the wagon, surprised by how carefully he moved, as if his body carried invisible wounds that went deeper than anything she could see. "The barn's where you'll sleep," she said, leading him across the yard. "It's not much, but it's dry, and there's hay for bedding. I've got some blankets I can bring out." He nodded, the burlap sack moving with the gesture, and she noticed how the rough fabric had chafed his neck raw where the rope held it in place. The sight made her stomach clench with sympathy she couldn't quite explain. "Are you hungry?" she asked, then felt foolish for the question. Of course he was hungry. Men up for auction weren't exactly fed like kings. "I've got beans and cornbread. Nothing fancy, but it's filling." Another nod, equally careful, equally silent. She showed him around the property with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned to make do with little. The well that had been dry for 18 months, its rope frayed and bucket, long since lost to the depths. The chicken coop that housed 3 scrawny hens when it should have held 20. The fences that sagged under their own weight, posts rotted at the base and wire stretched so thin it could barely contain air, let alone livestock. "I know it's not much to look at," she said, suddenly seeing her home through his eyes and feeling ashamed of its shabby state. "But it's honest work, and I pay what I owe." She realized immediately how that sounded. She had just bought him at auction, after all. He was here because she owned his labor, not because she was paying him wages. The distinction sat bitter on her tongue, but she pressed on, determined to treat him with whatever dignity the situation allowed. "The previous owner, my late husband, he always said this land had good bones. Just needed the right touch to bring it back to life." She gestured toward the barren fields where nothing had grown in 2 seasons. "I suppose we'll find out if he was right." As evening approached, Eliza prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, setting 2 places at her small kitchen table out of habit before catching herself. The proprieties of the situation were unclear. Was he a guest, an employee, property? The legal documents said one thing, but her conscience demanded another approach entirely. She solved the dilemma by carrying his portion to the barn on a tin plate, along with a cup of water from her diminishing supply. She found him sitting on a pile of hay, back straight against the wall, the burlap sack still firmly in place. "Here," she said, setting the food within his reach. "It's not much, but it'll keep you going." He looked up at her then, and even through the rough weave of the sack, she could sense his attention like a physical weight. For a moment she thought he might speak, might offer some word of thanks or acknowledgement, but the silence stretched between them, unbroken. "I'll leave you to eat in peace," she said finally, backing toward the barn door. "If you need anything during the night—" She stopped, realizing again how empty the offer was. What could she provide that would matter to a man in his situation? What comfort could she offer to someone who had been reduced to a commodity, sold for the price of a good meal? Back in her house, Eliza sat at her empty table and tried to eat her own supper, but the food turned to sawdust in her mouth. Every bite reminded her of the man in her barn, of the gentle way he had moved, despite his fearsome reputation, of the careful distance he maintained, as if afraid his very presence might contaminate her. She had acted on impulse at the auction, driven by a sympathy she couldn't quite explain, and a desperate hope that help might come in unexpected forms. But now, in the quiet of her kitchen, with lamplight flickering against the walls, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The stories Sheriff Carmichael had told her painted a picture of violence and madness, of a man who killed without reason and answered no questions about his actions. Yet the figure she had brought home seemed incapable of hurting so much as a fly. Either the stories were wrong, or there was more to this man than met the eye. As full darkness settled over the land, Eliza found herself standing at her kitchen window, looking toward the barn where a faint light flickered through the gaps in the weathered boards. She had given him a lantern along with his meal, and the warm glow spoke of basic human comfort that somehow made the situation feel less desperate. She was about to turn away when she saw him emerge from the barn, his tall silhouette unmistakable, even in the darkness. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, walking to the edge of her property, where the land fell away toward distant hills that lay invisible under the star-scattered sky. For long minutes he stood there, motionless as a statue, and Eliza found herself holding her breath as she watched. There was something profound in his stillness, something that spoke of communion with forces larger than himself. She had seen that kind of contemplation before, in her father when he stood looking over land he hoped to cultivate, in her husband when he gazed toward horizons that might hold their future. Then, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their deliberateness, he reached up and began to untie the rope that held the burlap sack in place. Eliza's heart stuttered in her chest. Part of her wanted to look away, to grant him privacy for what felt like an intensely personal moment. But she found herself unable to move, transfixed by the simple act of a man reclaiming his identity after hours of enforced anonymity. The sack fell away, and even in the faint starlight, she could see the outline of his profile, the strong jaw, the way he held his head with quiet dignity despite everything he had endured. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps close to her own age, with hair that caught the moonlight like dark water. He stood there for a moment, face lifted to the sky, as if drinking in the simple freedom of being seen, of existing without concealment. Then he turned, as if sensing her presence at the window, and their eyes met across the distance that separated them. Even through the darkness, she could feel the weight of his gaze, could sense the intelligence behind eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other, the woman who had bought his freedom with her last $2, and the man whose very presence had transformed her failing farm into something that might hold the possibility of redemption. His voice, when it came, carried across the still air like distant thunder, rich and deep, and filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. The single word fell between them like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through 20 years of memory and loss. Jonah. The name hit Eliza like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and setting her hands to trembling against the window glass. Images flashed through her mind with devastating clarity. 12-year-old girl running through smoke and gunfire, strong hands lifting her to safety, a voice promising that everything would be all right. This was him. This was the man who had saved her life, who had gathered the orphaned children and led them to safety through the longest night of her young existence. The protector who had appeared when hope was lost and vanished when safety was found. The ghost who had haunted her dreams and shaped her understanding of what it meant to be truly rescued. But how had he fallen so far? How had the hero of her childhood become the feared figure of local legend, the man accused of murder and sold at auction like common livestock? What terrible journey had brought him from the role of savior to that of the condemned? She pressed her face against the cool glass, trying to see him more clearly, to find in his adult features the echo of the man who had carried her across Silver Creek with such gentle strength. The distance and darkness made details impossible, but something in the way he stood patient, watchful, ready to disappear at the first sign of threat matched her memories perfectly. He remained there for several more minutes, as if waiting for some signal from her, some acknowledgement of the recognition that had passed between them. When none Camish found herself paralyzed by the enormity of the momentha, slowly bent to retrieve the burlap sack and walked back toward the barn. Eliza stood at the window long after he had disappeared from sight, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. If this truly was her childhood savior, then everything the sheriff had told her was either wrong or incomplete. The man who had risked everything to protect orphaned children was not capable of senseless murder, no matter what the evidence might suggest. But if he was innocent, why hadn't he defended himself? Why submit to auction rather than fight the charges? What had happened in the years since their paths had diverged to bring him to such desperate circumstances? Sleep eluded her that night, as questions chased each other through her mind like leaves in a whirlwind. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the lamplight, and tried to reconcile the gentle giant in her barn with the terrifying reputation that preceded him. Dawn came grey and hesitant, as if the sun itself was uncertain about illuminating what this day might bring. Eliza rose early and prepared a larger breakfast than usual: eggs from her 3 hens, bacon from her diminishing stores, biscuits made with the last of her good flour. If she was going to feed a man of Jonah's size, she would need to adjust her cooking accordingly. She carried the meal to the barn on her best china, decision that felt simultaneously foolish and necessary. If this man truly was her savior returned, he deserved better than tin plates and chipped cups. She found him already awake, sitting exactly where she had left him the night before, the burlap sack once again covering his features. The sight of it made her heart ache with unexpected sympathy. To hide one's face from the world suggested a shame or fear that went beyond physical concealment. "Good morning," she said, setting the tray down carefully. "I thought you might be hungry." He nodded, the same careful gesture she was beginning to recognize, and reached for the food with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from hunger, exhaustion, or something else entirely, she couldn't tell. "Jonah," she said softly, testing the name like a key in a long locked door. "Is that really your name?" The stillness that followed was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then, slowly, he nodded again, and she knew with absolute certainty that her $2 purchase had bought her far more than a strong back and willing hands. She had bought herself a piece of her own history, a fragment of the past that had shaped her into the woman she had become. The man who had saved her life as a child had returned to her as an adult, broken and silent, and carrying secrets that would either redeem them both or destroy whatever small piece she had managed to carve from the unforgiving Dakota soil. The broken well rope lay coiled in Eliza's hands like a dead snake, its frayed ends speaking of countless failed attempts to draw water from the stubborn earth. She had risen before dawn, unable to sleep for the weight of recognition that pressed against her chest like a stone. Jonah, the name echoed in her mind with each heartbeat, carrying 20 years of questions and the devastating certainty that the man in her barn was indeed the ghost who had saved her life. She found him already at work when she emerged from the house, his massive frame bent over the well's stone rim as he examined the ancient mechanism with the careful attention of someone who understood broken things. The burlap sack remained tied around his head, but she could see the concentration in his posture, the way his hands moved with surprising delicacy as he tested the remaining rope for weak spots. "It's been dry for 18 months, she said, approaching with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. "My husband always said it would come back when the rains returned, but the rains never did." Jonah looked up at her approach, and even through the rough weave of the sack, she could sense his attention focusing on her words. He reached for the coffee with hands that bore old scars across the knuckles, drinking it with the careful appreciation of someone who had learned not to take such simple comforts for granted. "Thomas, me husband, he was an optimistic man," she continued, settling onto the stone rim beside him. "Always believed tomorrow would be better than today. I suppose that's what killed him in the end, that hope. Got careless around the horses because he was thinking about spring planting instead of watching where he stepped." She had never spoken about Thomas's death to anyone, not even Martha Kellerman, who had been her closest neighbor and confidant. But something about Jonah's silent presence invited confidence, as if his own suffering had created a space where her grief could finally find voice. "I've tried to fix the rope myself," she said, watching as he examined the frayed ends with gentle fingers. "But I don't have the reach to get down to where it broke, and I can't afford to hire help." Jonah set down the coffee cup and stood, his height impressive even when he wasn't trying to intimidate. He walked to her small barn and emerged a moment later with a coil of new rope she didn't remember owning. The sight of it brought tears to her eyes. When had he found time to locate and prepare materials for the repair? He worked through the morning with methodical precision, lowering himself into the well's depths with movements that spoke of experience with dangerous places. Eliza found herself holding her breath each time he disappeared from view, afraid that he might vanish as completely as he had 20 years ago, leaving only questions and the echo of his name. Her mind drifted to that terrible morning by Silver Creek, when bandits had shattered her family's westward dreams with gunfire and death. She had been small enough then to hide behind the wagon wheels, small enough to believe that if she closed her eyes tight enough, the nightmare might end, and her parents would return to finish loading their belongings. The attack had come without warning, men on horseback, appearing through the morning mist like demons from a fever dream. She remembered her father reaching for his rifle, remembered her mother pushing her down behind a water barrel, remembered the sound of gunshots that seemed to go on forever. When the shooting stopped, she had run. 12-year-old legs had carried her toward the creek, toward anywhere that wasn't filled with smoke and screaming and the terrible silence that followed violence. She had fallen at the water's edge, too frightened to cross, too terrified to go back. That was when he had appeared. Even now, 20 years later, she could recall every detail of that first encounter. The way he had seemed to materialize from the smoke and chaos, moving with purpose while others fled in panic. His horse had been a big bay gelding, she remembered, and his hands had been gentle when he lifted her from the muddy bank. "Are you hurt, little one?" he had asked, his voice cutting through her terror with surprising warmth. She had shaken her head, unable to speak, clinging to his vest with desperate fingers as he carried her away from the devastation of her former life. "What's your name?" he had asked as they rode toward the other survivors. "Eliza," she had whispered, the word barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. "Eliza," he had repeated, and somehow the way he said it had made her feel like maybe she wasn't completely alone in the world. "That's a strong name. You're going to need to be strong now, Eliza." He had gathered the other orphaned children, 7 in total, ranging in age from 5 to 15, and had led them through the night toward the nearest settlement. She remembered the way he had shared his water, his food, his blanket with those who needed it most. The way he had sung quiet songs to keep their spirits up during the darkest hours, and how he had promised that tomorrow would bring safety and people who would care for them. True to his word, he had delivered them to St. Mary's Mission, where the nuns had taken them in with the boundless compassion that seemed to be their calling. But when Eliza had woken the next morning, eager to thank their rescuer properly, she found that he had vanished during the night, leaving only his promise that they would be safe and the memory of gentle hands that had pulled her from the wreckage of her old life. A sound from the well brought her back to the present, and she leaned forward to see Jonah emerging from its depths, his massive frame rising into the sunlight like something being born from the earth itself. His clothes were muddy and torn, and she could see fresh scratches on his arms where the stone walls had scraped against his skin. But he was smiling. She could see it in the way he held his head, in the satisfaction that radiated from his posture as he secured the new rope to the windlass mechanism. When he began to turn the handle, she held her breath, afraid to hope after so many months of disappointment. The rope descended smoothly into the darkness, and she could hear the distant splash as the bucket hit water far below. Jonah cranked the handle with steady rhythm, and slowly, impossibly, the bucket began to rise, heavy with the precious liquid she had given up hope of ever seeing again. When the bucket finally emerged into daylight, filled to the brim with clear, cold water, Eliza felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached out with trembling hands to touch the wooden rim, unable to believe that this simple miracle was real. "How?" she whispered, looking up at Jonah's concealed face. "How did you know where to look?" He set down the windlass handle and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small piece of metal that gleamed in the morning sun. When he placed it in her palm, she saw that it was an old brass fitting, corroded with age but still functional. The valve was closed, she realized, understanding flooding through her. All this time, the valve was just closed. Her husband had installed the mechanism 3 years ago, during the last good season they had enjoyed. It was designed to prevent contamination of the water supply, but Thomas had died before he could explain its operation to her. In her ignorance, she had assumed the well was dry, when in fact it had simply been sealed shut. Jonah nodded, and she could sense his satisfaction in the simple gesture. He had solved in one morning a problem that had plagued her for over a year, not through superior strength or mystical knowledge, but through careful observation and practical experience. Thomas would have felt so foolish, she said, laughing through her tears. All that worrying about drought and divine punishment, and it was just a valve he forgot to mention. She drew bucket after bucket of sweet water, filling every container she owned and several she had to borrow from the barn. The luxury of abundance after months of careful rationing felt almost decadent, and she found herself drinking glass after glass simply because she could. Her chickens seemed to sense the change immediately, clucking with renewed energy as she filled their water trough for the first time in memory. Even her old mare, grazing in the sparse pasture, lifted her head as if she could smell the moisture in the air. "We should celebrate," Eliza said impulsively, then felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. What kind of celebration could she offer to a man she had purchased at auction? What festivity was appropriate for someone in his circumstances? But Jonah seemed to understand her intention, nodding with the same careful courtesy he had shown since his arrival. She hurried to the house and returned with her best dishes, determined to mark the occasion with whatever dignity she could muster. They shared the midday meal beside the restored well, eating in companionable silence, while the sound of flowing water provided a musical backdrop to their simple feast. Eliza found herself stealing glances at her enigmatic companion, trying to reconcile the gentle soul who had fixed her well with the dangerous reputation that had preceded him to the auction. "The people in town," she said finally, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "They say you killed a man, a marshal." The stillness that followed was so complete she could hear individual drops of water falling back into the well's depths. Jonah's hands went motionless on his plate, and she could sense the weight of terrible memories pressing against the burlap barrier that concealed his face. When he finally nodded, the gesture was barely perceptible, but it sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. Here was confirmation of the stories that had made the auction crowd shrink away in fear, admission from the man himself that he had indeed taken a life. But as she studied his posture, the careful way he held himself, as if afraid his very presence might contaminate her, she realized that whatever violence he had committed weighed on him like a physical burden. This was not a man who killed casually or without remorse. This was someone haunted by actions he wished he could undo. "Were you protecting someone?" she asked gently, the words emerging from some deep intuition about the nature of the man who had once saved her life. Another nod, this one more certain, and she felt a weight lift from her chest that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The boy who had rescued orphaned children and the man who sat beside her well were the same person, shaped by 20 years of experiences she could only imagine, but fundamentally unchanged in his core nature. "Then you did what you had to do," she said simply, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "And whatever consequences you're facing, you don't deserve to be sold like livestock to pay for doing what was right." He looked up at her then, and even through the concealing sack, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. For a moment she thought he might speak, might offer some explanation or defense of his actions. But the silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle sound of water falling and the distant call of a meadowlark somewhere in the vast expanse of Dakota Prairie. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza stood at her kitchen window and watched Jonah tend to her chickens with a gentleness that would have seemed impossible in a man of his size and reputation. The birds showed no fear of him, clustering around his feet as he scattered grain with practiced efficiency. She had made the right choice at the auction, she realized. Whatever dark chapters filled the story between his childhood heroism and his current circumstances, the essential nature of the man remained unchanged. He was still a protector, still someone who appeared when hope was lost and worked quietly to restore what had been broken. The broken well rope that had seemed like such an insurmountable problem that morning now lay forgotten in a corner of the barn, replaced by new cordage and renewed hope. Like so many things in life, the solution had been simpler than she had imagined it, just required someone with the knowledge and patience to see what needed to be done. As darkness settled over the land and Jonah disappeared into the barn for the night, Eliza allowed herself to imagine what tomorrow might bring. For the first time in 18 months, she would wake to the sound of flowing water. For the first time since Thomas's death, she would not face the day's challenges alone. The man she had bought for $2 had already proved himself worth far more than the price she had paid. But she suspected that before their story reached its end, she would discover that some things, redemption, forgiveness, the simple miracle of two broken souls finding each other, were beyond any measure of earthly value. The hand-carved wooden cross lay half-hidden beneath Jonah's few possessions in the barn's corner, its surface worn smooth by countless fingers and stained dark with age and handling. Eliza discovered it by accident while bringing him fresh blankets, the morning light catching its simple lines as she arranged his makeshift bedding in the hay-filled stall he had claimed as his own. She had not meant to intrude on his privacy, but the sight of the cross stopped her cold. It was crude work, carved from what looked like oak, but there was something profoundly moving about its simplicity. This was not the polished religious ornament of a church, but something more personal, a talisman, carried by someone who had wrestled with questions of faith and morality in the dark hours when such struggles mattered most. "I'm sorry," she said, realizing Jonah had emerged from the shadows behind her, his massive frame filling the stall's entrance. "I was just bringing blankets and I saw—" She gestured helplessly at the cross, uncertain how to explain the mixture of curiosity and reverence that had transfixed her. In the 3 days since his arrival, she had learned to read the subtle language of his posture, and she could see tension in the way he held himself now, as if she had discovered something he had hoped to keep hidden. He moved past her with careful deliberation, picking up the cross and cradling it in his large hands like something precious and fragile. For a moment she thought he might put it away, ending the conversation before it could begin. Instead, he held it toward her, an offering that felt like trust. The wood was warm from his touch, worn smooth in places where thumbs had rubbed across its surface during countless prayers or moments of contemplation. When she turned it over, she could see initials carved into the back, J.M., and below them a date that made her breath catch in her throat. April 15, 1863. "This is from the war," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You carried this during the war." Jonah nodded, and she could see in his posture the weight of memories that reached back more than a decade. He would have been young then, perhaps no older than 20, carrying this simple cross through battles that had torn the nation apart and left scars on every man who survived them. "Were you with the Union?" she asked, then felt foolish for the question. Of course he had been with the Union. Confederate soldier would have risked his life to save a wagon train of orphaned children heading west to escape the war's aftermath. Another nod, accompanied by a gesture toward his chest that she interpreted as indicating rank or unit. She handed the cross back to him, watching as he traced its worn edges with fingers that trembled slightly in the morning light. The nightmares had started on his second night in her barn. She had been awakened by sounds of distress, not quite screams, but deep groans of anguish that carried across the yard like the cries of wounded animals. When she had looked from her bedroom window, she could see lamplight flickering through the barn's weathered boards and shadows, moving in ways that suggested violent struggle. She had dressed quickly and made her way across the yard, torn between respect for his privacy and concern for his well-being. The sounds had stopped by the time she reached the barn door, replaced by a silence that felt somehow more ominous than the distress that had preceded it. "Jonah," she had called softly, not wanting to startle him if he was still trapped in whatever dream had claimed him. "Are you all right?" The response had been so quiet, she almost missed it, a single word, spoken in a voice raw with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "Sorry." "You don't need to apologize," she had said, settling on a hay bale near his stall but carefully maintaining distance. We all carry our ghosts. She had stayed with him for an hour that night, not speaking, simply providing the comfort of human presence while he struggled to separate nightmare from reality. When his breathing had finally steadied and the tension had left his frame, she had returned to her house with questions that followed her into fitful sleep. Now, watching him handle the cross with such reverence, she began to understand the depth of the demons that visited him in darkness. This was not just a man haunted by recent violence, but someone who had been carrying the weight of death and moral compromise for over a decade. "How many battles?" she asked gently, settling beside him on the hay bale she had claimed during that first long night. He held up his hands, fingers spread, then repeated the gesture twice more. 15 battles, 15 occasions when he had been called upon to take lives in service of causes larger than himself. No wonder he carried nightmares like other men carried scars. "And after the war, when you saved us children?" This time his response was more complex, a series of gestures that she gradually interpreted as traveling, searching, trying to find peace in a world that offered little forgiveness for the things war had required of him. He had been a drifter, she realized, moving from place to place, taking work where he could find it, always carrying the cross and the weight of memories that refused to fade. "The marshal you killed," she said, the words emerging before she could consider their wisdom. "He was threatening someone?" The stillness that followed stretched like a taut wire between them, broken only by the soft sounds of her chickens pecking in the yard beyond the barn door. Then Jonah reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that he placed in her Palmer child's hair ribbon, faded blue silk that had once been bright as a summer sky. "A little girl," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. He was threatening a child. Jonah's nod was barely perceptible, but she could see in his posture the echo of the desperate urgency that must have driven him to violence. Here was the key to understanding his current circumstances. Not a senseless murder, but the same protective instinct that had led him to rescue orphaned children 20 years ago. "What happened to her, the little girl?" This time his gesture was more hopeful, a motion that suggested safety, distance, a threat removed. The child had survived, had been protected, just as Eliza and the other orphans had been protected all those years ago. Whatever the cost to himself, Jonah had ensured that innocence was preserved. She handed the ribbon back to him, watching as he tucked it carefully into his pocket beside the cross. These were his treasures, she realized, not gold or silver, but reminders of the lives he had touched and the choices he had made when faced with moral impossibility. "Why didn't you defend yourself when they arrested you?" The answer came in the form of a shrug so eloquent it needed no translation. What defense could he offer that would make sense to men who had not witnessed the threat, who had not seen the terror in a child's eyes? The marshal was dead by his hand. That was indisputable fact. The reasons, the moral complexity, the desperate calculations that had led to that moment were impossible to convey to those who had not lived them. Over the following days, a routine developed between them that felt as natural as breathing. Eliza would rise before dawn and prepare breakfast for two, carrying Jonah's portion to the barn along with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They would work together through the morning, he on the heavy repairs that required strength and reach, she on the countless smaller tasks that kept a farm functioning. The well had been only the beginning. With access to water restored, other possibilities began to present themselves. Jonah repaired the chicken coop with salvaged lumber and determination, expanding it to house the larger flock that clean water would support. He mended fences with wire she didn't know she possessed, and posts that appeared from some mysterious source during the night. But it was his way with her animals that truly amazed her. Her 3 hens, which had been listless and unproductive for months, began laying eggs with renewed enthusiasm under his gentle care. Her old mare, who had grown suspicious and difficult since Thomas's death, followed Jonah around the pasture like a devoted dog. "You have a gift," she said one afternoon, watching him examine the mare's hooves with professional competence. "Animals trust you." He looked up from his work, and even through the burlap sack, She could sense his attention focusing on her words. Then he gestured toward the chickens that clustered around his feet, unafraid of his massive frame and gentle movements. "They know," she continued, understanding dawning as she spoke. "Animals can sense when someone means them no harm. They know you're safe." The observation seemed to affect him deeply. His hands stilled on the mare's hoof, and she could see the careful way he absorbed her words, as if they were a gift he had not expected to receive. When he resumed his work, there was something different in his posture, small easing of the rigid control he maintained over himself. That evening brought visitors, though not the kind Eliza would have chosen. Sheriff Carmichael arrived just as the sun was touching the western horizon, accompanied by Deputy Morrison and two men she didn't recognize. Their presence filled her small yard with an official weight that made her chest tighten with anxiety. "Evening, Miss Boone," Carmichael said, touching his hat brim with practiced courtesy. "Hope you don't mind us stopping by. Wanted to check on how you're managing with your new acquisition." The word sat bitter in the air between them, reducing Jonah to the status of livestock or farm equipment. Eliza felt her spine stiffen with an indignation that surprised her with its intensity. "Mr. Jonah has been very helpful," she said, emphasizing the title with deliberate precision. "The well is working again, and the fences are nearly repaired." "That's good to hear," Carmichael replied, though his attention was clearly focused on scanning the property for signs of the man in question. "Mind if we have a word with him? Just routine, you understand." Before she could respond, Jonah emerged from the barn, his massive frame silhouetted against the lamplight within. Even at a distance, his presence changed the dynamic of the gathering, introducing an element of uncertainty that made the lawmen shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "There he is," Morrison muttered, his hand drifting toward the gun on his hip. "Big as they said." "Easy, Deputy," Carmichael warned, though his own posture had grown noticeably tenser. "We're just here to talk." Jonah approached with the same careful deliberation Eliza had come to recognize, stopping at what he clearly judged to be a respectful distance from the mounted men. The burlap sack concealed his features, but she could read tension in every line of his body. "How's he been treating you, Miss Boone?" Carmichael asked, never taking his eyes off Jonah. "Any problems? Any incidents?" "None whatsoever," she replied firmly. "He's been nothing but courteous and helpful." "And he hasn't tried to remove that sack? Hasn't spoken out of turn?" The questions rankled her with their implications of suspicion and distrust. These men saw Jonah as a dangerous animal barely contained by circumstance, not as the gentle soul who had fixed her well and tended her chickens with such obvious care. "He's spoken only when necessary," she said, which was true enough if incomplete. "And his appearance is his own business." One of the strangers, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time indoors, leaned forward in his saddle. "Ma'am, I'm Federal Marshal Hendricks. I need you to understand that this man is considered extremely dangerous. He killed a fellow officer in cold blood." "So I've been told," Eliza replied, her voice cooling several degrees. "But I've seen no evidence of violence. Quite the opposite, in fact. Killers can be charming when it suits their purposes," Hendricks continued. "They can appear gentle right up until the moment they strike. You shouldn't let your guard down just because he's been helpful around the farm." The implication stung more than Eliza had expected. Did they truly think her so naive, so desperate for help, that she would ignore genuine danger? Or was there something else at work here, some deeper suspicion about her motives for purchasing Jonah at auction? "I appreciate your concern," she said with icy politeness, "but I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs." "Of course you are," Carmichael said quickly, recognizing the warning signs of a woman whose patience was wearing thin. "We're just doing our job, Miss Boone, checking on the welfare of all parties involved." Jonah had remained silent throughout the exchange, but Eliza could see the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. Whatever control he maintained over his temper was being tested by the casual dismissal of his humanity, the easy assumption that his presence constituted an ongoing threat. "Was there anything else, gentlemen?" she asked, making it clear that their visit had reached its natural conclusion. Just remember what we've told you, Hendricks said, gathering his reins. If there's any trouble at all, you send word immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. After they had gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness with the sound of hoofbeats fading into silence, Eliza found herself standing in the yard beside Jonah, both of them looking toward the distant lights of town. "They're afraid of you," she said quietly, not certain if she was asking a question or stating an observation. Jonah nodded, and she could sense his resignation in the simple gesture. He had grown accustomed to fear. She realized had learned to expect it as the natural response to his presence and reputation. "But I'm not," she continued, the words emerging with more certainty than she had felt in years. "I'm not afraid of you, Jonah. I should be, according to everyone in town, but I'm not." He turned to look at her then, and even through the concealing sack, she could feel the weight of his attention. In the silence that stretched between them, she thought she heard him draw breath to speak, but no words came. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden cross, holding it toward her with the same trust he had shown that morning. This time, when she took it, she understood that he was offering more than just a glimpse into his past, was sharing the burden of the choices that had shaped him, the weight of the violence he carried, and the hope that someone might understand the man beneath the reputation. "Tomorrow," she said, handing the cross back to him, "we'll start on the south pasture. The fence there has been down since before Thomas died." It was a promise and a statement of faith rolled into one confirmation that she intended for him to stay, that his presence was welcome despite the warnings and suspicions of others. She watched as he carefully tucked the cross back into his pocket, and she thought she saw his shoulders straighten slightly, as if her trust had lifted some small portion of the burden he carried. That night, when the nightmares came again, she was ready for them. She made her way to the barn with a cup of warm milk and honey, settling on the hay bale that had become her customary seat during these dark hours. She didn't speak, didn't intrude on his struggle with whatever demons visited him in sleep, but simply provided the comfort of human presence until the worst of it passed. When he finally stirred to wakefulness, she could see the exhaustion in his movements, the careful way he oriented himself to time and place after being lost in the landscapes of memory and regret. "The war?" she asked gently. He shook his head, and she understood that tonight's nightmare had come from more recent events, the confrontation that had led to Marshal Davidson's death, perhaps, or the trial that had followed. "The little girl with the blue ribbon?" This time he nodded, and she felt her heart clench with sympathy for the impossible position he had been placed in. Whatever had happened in Deadwood, it had required him to choose between his own safety and the protection of an innocent child. Given his history, given the man she was coming to know, there had really been no choice at all. "She's safe now," Eliza said, offering the only comfort she could. "Because of what you did, she's safe." The silence that followed was different somehow, not the empty quiet of despair, but something that might have been the beginning of peace. She stayed with him until she was certain the worst had passed, then made her way back to her house with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities for understanding. As she lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted silver patterns through the window, Eliza reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been a woman alone, struggling to keep her farm from falling into complete ruin. Now she found herself caring for a man whose very presence challenged everything she thought she knew about justice, mercy, and the complicated mathematics of moral choice. The cross he carried spoke of faith tested by fire, of belief that had survived the worst humanity could offer. The child's ribbon represented the continuation of that faith, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of innocence. And the nightmares, those were the price such choices extracted, the weight that came with being someone others could depend on when hope seemed lost. She had paid $2 for his labor, but she was beginning to understand that she had purchased something far more valuable, a chance to know a man who embodied the kind of courage she had only dreamed of possessing, and the opportunity to offer sanctuary to someone who had spent his entire adult life protecting others at the cost of his own peace. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new questions, new tests of the fragile trust that was growing between them. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas's death, Eliza Boone fell asleep, feeling that she was not facing the future alone. The tattered, wanted poster had been nailed to the general store's bulletin board for so long that rain and sun had faded the ink to barely legible smudges, but Eliza's hands trembled as she tore it free from its rusty tacks. The face staring back at her from the weathered paper was unmistakably Jonah's younger, cleaner, but bearing the same strong jaw and steady eyes that had haunted her memory for 20 years. Wanted for murder, the bold letters proclaimed across the top, followed by a description that made her stomach clench with dread. Jonah McKenna, alias the Preacher, wanted for the brutal killing of U.S. Marshal William Davidson in Deadwood, Dakota Territory. 500 reward for capture, dead or alive. Extremely dangerous approach, with caution. She had come to town that morning for supplies, leaving Jonah working on the south pasture fence with instructions to stay close to the barn if any visitors arrived. The normalcy of her errands, flour, salt, a new lantern wick had been shattered by the sight of his face pinned to the board like a trophy, his likeness reduced to a commodity worth $500 to whoever could deliver him to justice. Martha Kellerman had been the one to point it out, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction that came with being first to share disturbing news. "That's him, isn't it? Your $2 purchase from the auction. Lord have mercy, Eliza. Do you know what you've brought into your home?" "I know exactly what I brought home," Eliza had replied with more confidence than she felt, but Martha's words had planted seeds of doubt that grew with each passing moment. Now, standing in her own kitchen with the poster spread across her table, she found herself studying every detail of the charges against him. The crime had occurred 3 months ago in Deadwood's notorious gambling district. Marshal Davidson had been found beaten to death in an alley behind the Gem Saloon, his skull crushed by what the coroner described as blunt force trauma consistent with bare-handed assault. Witnesses had seen Jonah leaving the scene, his clothes bloodied and his knuckles scraped raw. When confronted by other lawmen, he had neither resisted arrest nor offered any defense of his actions. He had simply stood there, silent and unmoving, while they bound his hands and led him away. The description of the crime was clinical in its brutality, but it was the photograph that truly unsettled her. The man in the image looked nothing like the gentle soul who tended her chickens and fixed her well. This was a hard face, marked by violence and carrying the kind of thousand-yard stare she had seen in veterans of the Indian Wars. "Jonah McKenna," she whispered, testing the full name on her tongue. McKenna should have recognized the Irish surname, should have connected it to the JM carved into his wooden cross. But the man she knew simply as Jonah seemed too immediate, too real, to be reduced to the stark facts of a wanted poster. The door creaked behind her, and she spun around to find Jonah himself standing in the entrance, his massive frame filling the doorway like a natural disaster made manifest. The burlap sack concealed his expression, but she could read shock in the sudden stillness that claimed his body. He had seen the poster. More than that, he understood what its presence in her kitchen meant, that his carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered, that the peaceful interlude they had shared was coming to an end. "When were you going to tell me?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "When were you going to tell me that you're worth $500 to anyone with a gun and a willingness to use it?" Jonah stepped into the kitchen and carefully closed the door behind him, moving with the deliberate caution of someone who understood that sudden movements could be misinterpreted. He approached the table slowly, his attention fixed on the poster that lay between them like evidence in a trial. When he reached for it, she didn't stop him, watching as his scarred fingers traced the edges of his own face with something that might have been nostalgia. This was who he had been before the burlap sack, before the silence, before whatever had broken inside him during that terrible night in Deadwood. "Did you do it?" she asked, the question emerging before she could consider its wisdom. "Did you kill Marshal Davidson?" The nod that followed was barely perceptible, but it hit her like a physical blow. Here was confirmation of the stories, admission from his own lips that he had indeed taken a life with his bare hands. Whatever she had hoped to her denial, explanation, justification was swept away by the simple honesty of his response. "Why?" she whispered, sinking into her chair as the full weight of the revelation settled upon her. "Why did you kill him?" Jonah set the poster carefully on the table and reached into his pocket, withdrawing the faded blue ribbon she had seen before. But this time, he placed it beside the paper, creating a tableau that spoke more eloquently than words ever could. The ribbon, the child, the same protective instinct that had driven him to save orphaned children 20 years ago had led him to violence in a deadwood alley. But what threat could have been so severe, so immediate, that it required such drastic action? "Show me," she said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit down and show me what happened." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy the request implied, but eventually lowered himself into the chair with careful precision. Even seated, he loomed over her small table, his presence transforming her kitchen into something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. What followed was a halting pantomime of events, conveyed through gestures and expressions she had to interpret like a foreign language. Gradually, the story emerged from his silent telling a tale of corruption, desperation, and the terrible mathematics of moral choice. The little girl had been perhaps 8 years old, the daughter of a Chinese immigrant who ran a small restaurant in Deadwood's least reputable district. Marshal Davidson had been extorting protection money from the immigrant community, using his badge to justify increasingly outrageous demands for security services. When the restaurant owner could no longer meet Davidson's demands, the marshal had taken the man's daughter as collateral, promising to return her when the debt was satisfied. But Jonah had seen the fear in the child's eyes, had recognized the particular terror that came with being trapped by someone who held absolute power over your fate. "You tried to negotiate," she said, reading the story in his gestures. "You tried to resolve it peacefully." Another nod, this one heavy with regret. He had approached Davidson in the saloon, offering to pay the girl's ransom from his own meager resources. But the marshal had been drunk and belligerent, more interested in asserting his authority than in reaching any reasonable solution. The confrontation had escalated when Davidson had bragged about his intentions for the child, describing plans that made Jonah's hands clench into fists, even in the retelling. There had been no choice then, no possibility of walking away while an innocent suffered at the hands of a corrupt lawman. "So you killed him," she said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "You beat him to death to save a child you didn't even know." The nod that followed was accompanied by something that might have been shame, as if he expected her to recoil from the knowledge of what his hands had done. Instead, she found herself reaching across the table to cover his scarred knuckles with her own fingers. "The girl," she said. "What happened to her?" This time his gesture was more hopeful, indicating safety, distance, a threat removed. The child had been returned to her father, the corrupt marshal was dead, and justice of a sort had been served. But the cost this reputation, his freedom, his peace of mind had been enormous. "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked, frustration bleeding into her voice. "Why didn't you explain what he was doing? Why didn't you defend yourself?" The answer came in the form of a shrug, so eloquent it needed no translation. Who would have believed the word of a drifter against the testimony of a federal marshal? What court would have accepted that the brutal murder of a lawman was justified by the protection of a Chinese immigrant's daughter? The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of separation and misunderstanding. She studied his concealed face, trying to reconcile the gentleman who fixed her well with the killer described in the wanted poster, and realized that they were the same person shaped by impossible choices and a moral code that valued innocent life above his own safety. $500, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's more money than I'll see in 5 years. More money than this farm will ever be worth." She could see the tension that claimed his frame, the careful way he prepared himself for what he clearly expected to be her next words. He was ready for her to turn him in, she realized. Ready for her to claim the reward that would solve all her financial problems and restore her place in the community's good graces. "I suppose," she continued, watching his hands clench and unclench with nervous energy, "I suppose I should thank you for trusting me with the truth." The stillness that followed was so complete she could hear individual drops of water falling from the kitchen pump into the basin below. Then, slowly, his head lifted, and she could sense his attention, focusing on her with the intensity of a man who had just been offered salvation when he expected damnation. "You're not what they say you are," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're not a cold-blooded killer or a dangerous madman. You're exactly what you've always been, someone who appears when innocence is threatened and does whatever it takes to protect those who can't protect themselves." The wanted poster lay between them like a challenge to everything she thought she understood about justice and mercy. But as she looked at this man who had saved her life as a child and sacrificed his own freedom to protect another child 20 years later, she realized that some truths were more important than the law's narrow definitions of right and wrong. "The question now," she said, folding the poster and sliding it across the table toward him, "is what we do about it. Because as long as this is hanging in every town from here to California, you'll never be safe. And as long as you're not safe, anyone who helps you is in danger too." It was a practical consideration wrapped in an emotional truth. She cared about his welfare, but she also understood the position his presence put her in. If Federal Marshal Hendricks returned and found evidence that she was harboring a wanted fugitive, her own freedom would be forfeit. "There has to be another way," she said, thinking aloud. "Some way to clear your name or at least tell your side of the story. Someone who knew Marshal Davidson, who could testify to his character and actions." Jonah reached for his pocket and withdrew a small leather notebook, its pages yellowed with age and handling. When he opened it and placed it before her, she saw that it was filled with careful handwriting dates, names, descriptions of incidents that painted a picture of systematic corruption and abuse. "You kept records," she breathed, understanding dawning as she scanned the entries. "You documented everything he did." The notebook was a catalogue of Davidson's crimes against the immigrant community: extortion, assault, theft, and worse. Each entry was dated and signed with the careful precision of someone who understood the importance of evidence, someone who had hoped that the truth might eventually matter more than the badge Davidson wore. "This changes everything," she said, her excitement growing as she read through the meticulous documentation. "This is proof of what he was doing, evidence that you had justification for your actions." But even as hope flared in her chest, reality began to reassert itself. The notebook was compelling evidence, but it was also the word of a wanted fugitive against a dead federal marshal. Without corroborating testimony, without witnesses willing to come forward, it might not be enough to clear his name. "We need help," she said finally, closing the notebook and meeting his hidden gaze. "We need someone with authority, someone who cares more about justice than jurisdiction." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts, and they both froze as the familiar rhythm of multiple horses filled the afternoon air. Through the kitchen window, she could see Sheriff Carmichael and his deputies riding up the path, their faces grim with official purpose. "Hide the poster," she whispered urgently, watching as Jonah folded the wanted notice and slipped it into his pocket alongside the notebook and ribbon. "And whatever happens, let me do the talking." As the lawman dismounted outside her door, Eliza felt the weight of the choice before her settle like a stone in her chest. She could turn Jonah in now, claim the reward, and return to her solitary struggle to save her failing farm. Or she could stand by a man who had risked everything to protect the innocent, knowing that her decision might cost her everything she had worked to build. The knock on her door was firm and official, carrying the authority of men who expected immediate compliance with their demands. But as she rose to answer it, Eliza Boone knew that some things: loyalty, justice, the debt of gratitude owed to someone who had saved her life, were worth more than safety or money. or the approval of those who preferred easy answers to complex truths. The faded photograph trembled in Eliza's hands as she stared at faces that belonged to another lifetime, their sepia-toned features carrying echoes of joy and hope that seemed impossible now. She had found it while searching through her mother's belongings for anything that might support Jonah's story, desperate for some tangible connection between his documented accusations and the corruption he claimed to have witnessed. But this picture told a different story entirely, one that reached back even further than Marshal Davidson's crimes to the foundational moment that had shaped both their lives. The image showed a group of children gathered around a tall man in a worn cavalry uniform, their faces bright with the particular joy that comes after surviving something terrible. And there, in the center of the group, was her own 12-year-old face, still marked by grief but beginning to show the first signs of healing. "Mother kept this all these years," she whispered, her finger tracing the familiar features of the man who stood behind the children like a guardian angel made flesh. Even in the blurred detail of an old photograph, she could see the gentleness in his eyes, the careful way he held himself so as not to intimidate those he had rescued. She had been looking through the trunk in her mother's old bedroom, searching for any documentation that might help establish Jonah's character letters, perhaps, or records from the mission where they had been placed after the rescue. The photograph had been tucked between pages of her mother's Bible, preserved like a pressed flower that held memories too precious to lose. Now, carrying it downstairs to where Jonah waited in the kitchen, she felt the weight of 20 years collapsing into a single moment of recognition. The man in the photograph and the man at her table were unmistakably the same person, separated by decades of hardship, but united by the fundamental decency that had driven him to protect innocence, regardless of the cost to himself. "Look," she said, placing the photograph beside his notebook of evidence against Davidson. "This is us. This is all of us. After you brought us to St. Mary's mission." Jonah's reaction was immediate and profound. His entire body went still as he stared at the image, and she could see his hands trembling as he reached for it, with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. Through the burlap sack, she could sense the intensity of his focus, the way memory was flooding back with devastating clarity. "You remember," she said, settling into the chair beside him rather than across from him, suddenly needing the comfort of proximity. "You remember all of us?" His nod was accompanied by a gesture toward the photograph that she interpreted as amazement, not that the picture existed, but that she had kept it, that this moment had been preserved when so much else from their shared past had been lost to time and circumstance. "Sister Margaret took this picture," Eliza continued, her own memories beginning to surface with startling vividness. "She said it was important to document our rescue, to have some record of the man who had saved us. But when we woke up the next morning, you were gone." She could see the way his attention focused on her words, could sense him absorbing the details of a departure he might not have fully understood from the other side. To him, leaving had probably seemed like the natural conclusion to his due-tithe. Children were safe, cared for, no longer in need of his protection. But to them, his absence had felt like abandonment, like waking from a dream of safety, only to find themselves alone again. "We asked about you for weeks," she said, her voice growing thick with remembered emotion. "Sister Margaret said you were a traveling man, that you had your own path to follow. But we kept hoping you'd come back, that maybe you'd stay and be, I don't know, a father figure, I suppose, someone permanent in lives that had lost so much." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of paths not taken, of connections that might have been if circumstances had been different. She wondered what his life might have looked like if he had chosen to stay at the mission, if he had allowed himself to become part of the family they had tried to build from the wreckage of their former lives. "The other children," she continued, studying the faces in the photograph. "Do you ever wonder what happened to them?" His gesture indicated scattered directions, the inevitable dispersal of people whose only connection had been trauma shared and overcome. But she could see in his posture that he carried them all with him, that the responsibility he had accepted that terrible morning by Silver Creek had never truly ended. "Timothy Hartwell," she said, pointing to a gap-toothed boy who had been perhaps 10 when the picture was taken. "He was adopted by a family in Kansas. Became a teacher, I heard. And little Sarah," she touched the face of the youngest survivor, a girl who had barely been able to walk when Jonah carried her to safety. "The Carmichaels took her in. She's married now, has children of her own." Each name seemed to affect him like a physical touch, and she realized that these children had not been merely a duty to him, but individuals whose welfare had mattered on a deeply personal level. The notebook filled with evidence against Marshal Davidson was not an anomaly, but part of a pattern. This was a man who collected the stories of those he protected, who carried their fates with him long after their immediate danger had passed. "This is why you keep the ribbon," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "It's not just about the girl you saved from Davidson. It's about all of them all, the innocents you've protected over the years." His nod confirmed her intuition, and she felt something shift in her understanding of who Jonah McKenna truly was. The wanted poster painted him as a killer, a dangerous man who solved problems with violence. But the truth was far more complex, was a guardian who appeared when hope was lost, who intervened when no one else would act, who carried the weight of those interventions for the rest of his life. "How many others have there been?" she asked gently. "How many times have you stepped in when someone needed protection?" The answer came in the form of a shrug that suggested the number was too large to count, too painful to catalogue completely. But she could see in his posture that each intervention had cost him something: reputation, safety, peace of mind, until he had become the silent, haunted figure who now sat at her kitchen table. "And each time you disappeared afterward," she said, the pattern becoming clear. "Each time you made sure they were safe, and then moved on before anyone could ask questions or demand explanations." Another nod, and she understood the loneliness that gesture implied. He had spent 20 years helping others, and then vanishing before relationships could form, before gratitude could become connection. Always the protector, never the protected. Always the solution to others' problems, never allowed to have problems of his own. "Until Deadwood," she said quietly. "Until Marshal Davidson, when you couldn't disappear because they caught you at the scene." This time his stillness carried a different quality, not the patient endurance she had grown accustomed to, but something that might have been relief. For 20 years he had carried the weight of his interventions alone, had borne the consequences of his choices, without anyone to share the burden. But here, in her kitchen, with evidence spread between them like a battle map, he was no longer alone. "We're going to clear your name," she said, the words emerging with more confidence than she felt. "We're going to find a way to tell this story properly, to make people understand what really happened in that alley." But even as she spoke, she could see the skepticism in his posture. He had lived with the consequences of his choices for too long to believe that truth alone would be enough to overcome reputation and prejudice. The world wanted simple stories, heroes and villains, good and evil, black and white, not the complex moral mathematics that had governed his life. "The notebook is a start," she continued, opening it again to scan the careful documentation. "But we need more. We need witnesses, people who saw Davidson's corruption firsthand and would be willing to testify about it." His gesture indicated the futility of such hope. The people who could corroborate his story were mostly immigrants and outcasts, individuals whose testimony would carry little weight against the word of federal law enforcement. The very people Davidson had victimized were the least likely to be believed by a system that had already failed to protect them. "Then we find someone with authority," she said, refusing to accept defeat. "Someone who cares more about justice than jurisdiction, who has the power to investigate Davidson's record and uncover the truth." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning, and they both turned toward the window to see Sheriff Carmichael returning with an even larger group of deputies and federal agents. This time, their formation and bearing suggested official business of the most serious kind. "They know," she breathed, understanding flooding through her as she saw Federal Marshal Hendricks among the mounted men. Someone told them about the wanted poster, about who you really are. Jonah was already moving, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years preparing for moments like this. But instead of heading for the back door or the barn where he might find temporary shelter, he moved toward her, placing his large hands gently on her shoulders. For a moment, she thought he might finally speak, might offer some word of gratitude or explanation or farewell. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden cross, pressing it into her palm with careful deliberation. "No," she said, trying to push it back toward him. "You're not saying goodbye. We're going to fight this together." But he was already moving toward the door, his massive frame filling the entrance as he prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him outside. The photograph of their shared past lay forgotten on the table, 20-year-old faces smiling up at a scene that had suddenly become tragically relevant again. "Jonah," she called after him, her voice breaking with emotions she couldn't name. "Jonah, wait." He paused at the threshold, his concealed face turning back toward her one last time. In the silence that stretched between them, she could feel the weight of everything left unsaid: gratitude for the past, hope for the future, and the terrible knowledge that some choices could not be unmade once the moment for action had arrived. The knock on her door was firm and immediate, carrying the authority of men who had come to collect what they viewed as their rightful prize. But as Eliza clutched the wooden cross and stared at the man who had saved her life twice, no once as a child, once as a woman in need of hope, he realized that some debts could never be fully repaid, and some loyalties transcended law and reason and the simple mathematics of reward money. "Whatever happens," she said, her voice carrying across the kitchen with desperate intensity, "whatever they do to you, know that someone understands. Someone knows the truth about who you really are. The wanted poster might paint him as a killer, the law might brand him as a fugitive, but the photograph on her table told a different story, entirely one of a guardian who had spent his entire adult life protecting those who could not protect themselves, regardless of the cost to his own freedom and peace." As the voices outside grew more insistent and official, Eliza Boone realized that her $2 purchase had brought her something far more valuable than help with farm chores. It had returned to her the missing piece of her own story, the guardian angel who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be truly saved. The wooden cross felt warm in her palm as she rose to face whatever judgment awaited them both beyond her kitchen door. But first, she carefully folded the photograph and tucked it into her apron pocket alongside the cross, preserving the evidence of their shared past like ammunition for the battle that was about to begin. When she opened the door, Federal Marshal Hendricks stood at the head of a group that had grown to include 6 mounted men, their faces grim with official purpose. Behind them, she could see several townspeople gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the spectacle of federal law enforcement descending upon her small farm. "Miss Boone," Hendricks said, touching his hat brim with perfunctory courtesy, "we're here for the man you purchased at auction. We have reason to believe he's the fugitive Jonah McKenna, wanted for the murder of Marshal Davidson." "And what reason would that be?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her words. "A concerned citizen brought us this," Hendricks replied, producing a copy of the wanted poster she had torn from the general store bulletin board, "along with testimony that your hired man matches the description exactly." Martha Kellerman, she realized with a bitter taste in her mouth. Her neighbor had wasted no time in claiming whatever reward might come from reporting a suspected fugitive, regardless of the consequences for the woman who had befriended her. "I see," she said carefully, her mind racing through possible responses. "And you believe this man, assuming he is who you think he is, represents some kind of threat to my safety?" "Ma'am, this man beat a federal marshal to death with his bare hands," Hendricks replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I'd say that represents a threat to anyone in his vicinity." "Then perhaps," she said, stepping aside to allow them to see Jonah standing in her kitchen doorway, "you should ask him yourself why Marshal Davidson died." The reaction was immediate and electric. Deputies reached for their weapons, horses shied at the sudden tension, and Hendricks himself took a step backward as he confronted the massive figure that filled the entrance to her home. "Jonah McKenna," Hendricks called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "You're under arrest for the murder of U.S. Marshal William Davidson. Come out with your hands visible." Jonah moved with the same careful deliberation she had grown accustomed to, stepping into the doorway with his massive hands raised to show he carried no weapons. The burlap sack still concealed his features, but his posture spoke of resignation mixed with a dignity that even shackles could not diminish. "Remove the hood," Hendricks ordered. "Show your face." For a moment, Eliza thought Jonah might refuse, might maintain the anonymity that had become his shield against a world that judged him on reputation rather than truth. But then his hands moved to the rope that held the sack in place, untying it with the ceremonial precision she had witnessed that first evening. When the burlap fell away, revealing features that were both harder and more gentle than the wanted poster suggested, she heard several of the deputies draw sharp breaths. This was not the face of a mindless killer, but of a man who had seen too much and carried too much, whose eyes held depths of sorrow that spoke to experiences beyond most people's comprehension. "There he is," one of the townspeople called out from the gathered crowd. "That's the man from the auction, sure enough." "Jonah McKenna," Hendricks said, his voice carrying both satisfaction and wariness. "You're under arrest for murder. You have the right to remain silent, though from what I hear, that won't be much of a change for you." "Wait," Eliza said, stepping forward before the deputies could approach with their shackles. "Before you take him, there's something you need to see. Evidence that might change your understanding of what happened in Deadwood." She produced the notebook from her apron pocket, holding it toward Hendricks with hands that trembled only slightly. "This is a record of Marshal Davidson's activities, documented by the man you're arresting. I think you'll find it illuminating." Hendricks took the notebook with obvious skepticism, but as he scanned the careful entries, his expression began to change. The dates, names, and descriptions painted a picture of systematic corruption that was impossible to dismiss as fabrication. "This is detailed," he admitted, his voice losing some of its certainty. "But it's also the word of an accused murderer against a dead federal officer." "Then verify it," she challenged, pulling out the photograph and extending it toward him. "This is Jonah McKenna, 20 years ago, after he rescued 7 orphaned children from a bandit attack near Silver Creek. I was one of those children, Marshal Hendricks. This man saved my life when I was 12 years old." The photograph seemed to affect the lawman more than the notebook had, perhaps because it showed a younger Jonah in military uniform, surrounded by children whose faces glowed with gratitude and trust. Here was visible proof that the man they were arresting had once been someone very different from the killer described in official reports. "Even if this is true," Hendricks said slowly, studying the image with obvious confusion, "it doesn't change what happened in Deadwood. It doesn't excuse murder." "No," she agreed, "but it might explain it. And if you're interested in justice rather than just closing a case, you might want to understand why a man with a history of protecting children would risk everything to kill a federal marshal." The silence that followed was broken by Jonah himself, who stepped forward and began removing items from his pockets with careful precision. The child's blue ribbon came first, followed by several other small objects: a locket, a carved wooden horse, a pressed flow reach representing some life he had touched or protected over the years. "Trophies," one of the deputies muttered, but Eliza could see understanding dawning in Hendricks' eyes as he recognized the true nature of the collection. "Not trophies," she said quietly. "Reminders, proof that the people he protected were real, that their lives mattered enough to be remembered." Jonah reached into his vest pocket and withdrew one final item, a small daguerreotype that he handed to Hendricks with obvious reluctance. The image showed a Chinese girl of perhaps 8 years, her face bright, with the particular joy of childhood before tragedy touched it. "That's her," Eliza said, understanding flooding through her as the pieces of the story fell into place. That's the child Marshal Davidson was threatening. That's why Jonah killed him. Hendricks studied the photograph for a long moment, his official composure beginning to crack as the full implications of what he was seeing settled upon him. Here was evidence of a pattern-not, random violence, but a lifetime spent intervening when innocents were threatened, regardless of the personal cost. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been since his arrival. "The girl?" Jonah gestured toward the west, indicating distance and safety, then touched his heart in a gesture that spoke of ongoing concern for her welfare. The child was alive, protected, beyond the reach of those who would harm her. But the cost of that protection was standing before them in shackles that had not yet been applied. "Marshal Hendricks," Eliza said, seizing upon the moment of uncertainty she could see in his face. "I'm not asking you to ignore the law. I'm asking you to investigate it. If Marshal Davidson was truly the corrupt officer this evidence suggests, then his death might have been justified. And if it was justified, then the man who killed him deserves justice, not punishment." The federal marshal looked from the notebook to the photographs to the quiet figure of Jonah McKenna, who stood waiting for judgment with the patience of someone who had long ago accepted that justice and law were not always the same thing. "The investigation would have to be thorough," Hendricks said finally, his words carrying the weight of a man wrestling with competing duties. "We'd need to verify these claims, interview witnesses, examine Davidson's official records." "Then do it," she urged, stepping closer to Jonah in a gesture of solidarity that was not lost on the watching crowd. "Give him the trial he never had, the chance to tell his side of the story properly. Give justice a chance to be more than just expedience." The silence stretched between them like a bridge spanning the gap between law and mercy, between official duty and human understanding. In that moment, Eliza realized that everything Jonah's freedom, her own future, the very definition of justice itself hung in the balance of one man's willingness to look beyond the surface of a case that had already been decided in the court of public opinion. When Hendricks finally nodded, it was with the reluctant acceptance of someone who understood that some truths were too important to ignore, regardless of how inconvenient they might prove to be. "We'll take him back to town," he said, "but under protective custody, not as a condemned man. And we'll investigate these claims properly, following the evidence wherever it leads." As the deputies moved forward with shackles that seemed somehow less final than they had moments before, Eliza felt tears streaming down her cheeks. It was not the victory she had hoped for, but it was something more valuable, a promise that truth would be given a chance to compete with prejudice, that justice might prove stronger than expedience. "Thank you," she whispered to Hendricks as Jonah was led toward the waiting horses. "Thank you for being willing to look beyond the obvious answers." The federal marshal touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, but his attention was focused on the collection of evidence she had provided. Already she could see him beginning the mental process of investigation, of following leads and verifying claims that might reshape his understanding of what had happened in that deadwood alley. As the official party prepared to depart, Jonah turned back toward her one final time, his eyes meeting hers across the distance that separated them. In that look, she saw gratitude for her faith in him, hope for a future that might include redemption, and something that might have been love or not romantic, but the deep affection that grows between souls who have recognized each other across the vastness of human experience. "I'll be waiting," she called after him, her voice carrying across the yard with fierce determination. "Whatever happens, however long it takes, I'll be here when you come home." The word home seemed to affect him more than anything else that had passed between them, and she saw his shoulders straighten slightly as he was helped onto one of the horses. For the first time since his arrival, Jonah McKenna looked like a man who had something to live for beyond mere survival. As the official party disappeared down the road toward town, taking with them the man who had become the center of her world, Eliza stood in her doorway and clutched the wooden cross he had given her. The photograph in her pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of shared history, while the notebook's careful documentation offered the promise that truth might yet prevail over prejudice. She had paid $2 for a strong back and willing hands, but she had received something far more precious, the chance to repay a debt 20 years in the making, and the opportunity to prove that some loyalties transcended law and reason and the simple mathematics of reward money. Now all that remained was to wait and hope that justice would prove worthy of the faith they had placed in it. The marshal's badge lay hidden beneath a layer of dust and hay in the deepest corner of Jonah's makeshift bedroll, its brass surface tarnished with age, but still bearing the distinctive eagle and shield that marked it as genuine federal property. Eliza discovered it while cleaning out the barn stall he had occupied 3 days after his arrest, when the silence of his absence had become unbearable and she had sought comfort in maintaining the space where he had found temporary peace. Her hands trembled as she lifted the badge toward the lamplight, reading the inscription that would change everything she thought she understood about the man she had sheltered. Deputy U.S. Marshal J. McKenna, appointed 1871. Below that, in smaller script, were the words that stopped her breath entirely. Special assignment, Territorial Justice Division. Dear God, she whispered, sinking onto the hay bale where she had spent so many nights comforting him through his nightmares. You weren't just protecting that little girl. You were investigating Davidson all along. The implications crashed over her like a flood, recontextualizing everything from their first meeting to his silent acceptance of arrest and trial. Jonah McKenna had not been a drifter who stumbled into a situation requiring heroic intervention. He had been a federal agent operating under deep cover, gathering evidence against a corrupt colleague who had been abusing his authority for months or perhaps years. She clutched the badge to her chest, understanding flooding through her as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed began clicking into place. The careful documentation in his notebook wasn't the obsessive record-keeping of a vigilante, it was the methodical evidence-gathering of a professional investigator. His reluctance to defend himself wasn't shame or acceptance of guilt, it was the disciplined silence of an agent protecting an ongoing operation. That's why you couldn't speak, she said aloud, addressing the empty stall as if he was still there to hear her revelation. That's why you let them arrest you and put you up for auction. You were maintaining your cover, even at the cost of your own freedom. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her stunned contemplation, and she quickly tucked the badge into her apron pocket as Sheriff Carmichael's familiar silhouette appeared in the barn doorway. "Miss Boone," he said, removing his hat with the careful courtesy that had marked all their interactions. "Thought you'd want to know we've had some developments in the McKenna case." "What kind of developments?" she asked, rising to meet him with her heart hammering against her ribs. Federal Marshal Hendricks received a telegram this morning from the Territorial Justice Department in Denver. Seems they've been looking for Deputy McKenna for quite some time, wondering why his regular reports had stopped coming. The relief that washed over her was so intense it left her lightheaded. If the federal authorities were looking for Jonah, if they knew about his assignment and were concerned about his welfare, then everything was about to change. He was working for them, she said, producing the badge from her pocket with hands that barely shook. He was investigating Davidson under orders from his superiors. Carmichael's eyes widened as he recognized the significance of what she was showing him. "Where did you find this?" "In his belongings. Hidden, but not destroyed, I think. I think he wanted someone to find it eventually, when it was safe to reveal the truth." The sheriff took the badge with obvious reverence, examining the inscription and authentication marks with the trained eye of someone who understood the weight such items carried in questions of law and jurisdiction. "This changes everything," he said finally, his voice heavy with the implications. If McKenna was operating under federal orders, then Davidson's death wasn't murder, it was the elimination of a corrupt officer by a duly authorized agent of the law. "But why didn't he tell you this when he was arrested?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because his mission wasn't complete," Carmichael replied, confirming her intuition. If there were other corrupt officials involved, other investigations running parallel to his, revealing his identity could have compromised everything. The scope of what Jonah had sacrificed began to dawn on her, not just his freedom and reputation, but the success of operations that might have taken years to develop. He had chosen to endure auction, arrest, and the threat of execution rather than reveal information that might have allowed other criminals to escape justice. "We need to get this to Hendricks immediately," she said, moving toward the barn door with sudden urgency. "If there are other agents at risk, if there are ongoing investigations—" "Already done," Carmichael interrupted, producing a folded telegram from his pocket. "Hendricks sent word to Denver as soon as your evidence raised questions about the official story. They've confirmed McKenna's assignment and authorized his immediate release." The paper crackled as she unfolded it, but the words blurred through the tears that sprang to her eyes. After days of uncertainty, of not knowing whether her faith in him had been justified, here was official vindication of everything she had believed about his character and motives. "When?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When will he be released?" "This afternoon, if the paperwork can be processed in time. But Miss Boone—" Carmichael's voice carried a warning that made her look up from the telegram with sudden apprehension. "You need to understand that his assignment isn't necessarily over. The Justice Department may have other work for him, other investigations that require his particular skills." The meaning was clear. Jonah's freedom might come at the cost of his continued presence in her life. Having sacrificed so much to maintain his cover, he might be reassigned to another territory, another mission that would take him far from the small farm where he had found temporary peace. "I understand," she said, though the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "His duty comes first." But even as she spoke them, she couldn't quite believe the words. After everything they had shared, after the connection that had grown between them, despite the barriers of silence and circumstance, she couldn't accept that their story would end with his simple disappearance into another assumed identity. "There's something else," Carmichael said, his voice gentling in a way that suggested he understood her feelings better than she had realized. "According to the telegraph operator, McKenna specifically requested that any communications about his status be shared with you. Seems he's named you as his emergency contact." The significance of that gesture hit her like a physical blow. In the careful hierarchy of federal law enforcement, where trust was measured in classified clearances and need-to-know protocols, Jonah had identified her as the person who should be informed about his welfare. It was an official acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, a declaration that she mattered enough to be included in the most sensitive aspects of his professional life. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "It means," Carmichael said with something that might have been a smile, "that Deputy McKenna considers you family, and in the federal service, that's not a designation they use lightly." Family. The word echoed in her mind as she made her way back to the house, her thoughts spinning with possibilities she had barely allowed herself to consider. Was it possible that their connection meant as much to him as it did to her? Could a man who had spent 20 years moving from mission to mission, never staying long enough to form lasting attachments, have found something worth staying for? The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness as she waited for word of his release. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, prepared a meal large enough to feed a working man, and tried to ignore the way her heart jumped at every sound that might herald his return. The badge remained on her kitchen table like a talisman, its brass surface catching the light in ways that spoke of authority and purpose and the weight of service to something larger than oneself. When the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, she heard the sound she had been waiting for, the steady clip-clop of horses approaching her property. But this time, instead of the grim procession of lawmen that had taken him away, she saw only two riders, Federal Marshal Hendricks and the unmistakable figure of Jonah McKenna, no longer shackled, no longer hiding his face behind burlap concealment. She ran from the house without thinking, her feet carrying her across the yard with a speed that would have embarrassed her under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. This was the return of a man she had thought might be lost to her forever, the vindication of faith that had sustained her through days of uncertainty and fear. When Jonah dismounted and turned toward her, she could see the change that freedom had wrought in his bearing. The careful tension that had marked his every movement was gone, replaced by something that might have been peace. His face, no longer hidden, showed the wear of recent stress, but also a lightness she had never seen before. "Eliza," he said, and the sound of her name spoken in his voice, the first word she had heard him speak directly to her since that evening, by the well made her stop in her tracks. "You can talk," she said, laughing through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Of course you can talk. I've been waiting for the right moment," he replied, his voice carrying the warm timbre she remembered from her childhood, but deepened by years of experience and responsibility. "The right time to tell you who I really am. Deputy U.S. Marshal Jonah McKenna," she said, producing his badge from her apron pocket. "Special assignment, Territorial Justice Division." The surprise on his face was quickly replaced by something that might have been relief. "You found it." "I was cleaning your stall," she admitted, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the liberty she had taken with his possessions. I hoped there might be something that would help your case." "You saved my life," he said simply, taking the badge from her hands and pinning it to his vest with movements that spoke of long practice. "Your faith, your testimony, the evidence you provided it, gave Marshal Hendricks the foundation he needed to contact my superiors and verify my assignment." Hendricks cleared his throat diplomatically, reminding them of his presence. "Deputy McKenna, I'll need you to report to the Denver office within the week for debriefing. But given the circumstances, the department has authorized extended leave for recovery and personal matters." The phrase, "personal matters," hung in the air between them like a question waiting to be answered. Eliza found herself studying Jonah's face, trying to read in his expression what role she might play in whatever came next. "How long?" she asked, addressing the question to both men simultaneously. "That depends," Hendricks said tactfully, "on how quickly Deputy McKenna feels ready to return to active duty, and on whether he has reasons to stay in one place long enough to recover properly," Jonah added, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility, with the weight of choices that would shape whatever came next for both of them. She thought of the empty house behind her, of the farm that was finally beginning to show signs of recovery thanks to his efforts, of the life she had built in solitude and the chance to rebuild it in partnership. "The well still needs tending," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "And the south pasture fence won't stay repaired without regular maintenance." "Those sound like good reasons to stay," he replied, and she could see in his smile the echo of the man who had carried her across Silver Creek 20 years ago, who had promised that everything would be all right. As Marshal Hendricks prepared to depart, offering congratulations and assurances that the Justice Department would provide whatever support they needed during Jonah's recovery, Eliza found herself standing beside the man who had transformed her understanding of justice, duty, and the complicated mathematics of moral choice. "Deputy McKenna," she said, testing the sound of his official title. "Just Jonah," he corrected gently. "At least here, at least with you. I've spent too many years hiding who I really am to want to do it anymore." The badge on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight, its brass surface gleaming with the authority of federal law enforcement. But as she looked at the man who wore it, she saw not the distant figure of official duty but the gentle soul who had fixed her well, tended her chickens, and carried 20 years of protective instincts in his scarred hands. "Welcome home, Jonah," she said, and in those simple words lay the promise of sanctuary, understanding, and the chance to build something permanent from the ashes of everything they had both lost and found. The wedding ring set lay nestled in their original velvet box on Eliza's kitchen table, the simple gold bands catching the morning light with a promise that seemed both impossible and inevitable. Jonah had produced them from his saddlebags the evening before, along with a confession that made her hands tremble and her heart race with possibilities she had hardly dared to imagine. "I bought these in Denver," he had said, his voice carrying the careful vulnerability of a man unaccustomed to revealing his deepest hopes. 3 years ago, before the Davidson assignment, I thought, I hoped that someday I might find someone worth staying still for. Now, as she prepared breakfast for two in the kitchen that had become the center of their shared world, Eliza found herself stealing glances at the rings while her mind wrestled with the magnitude of what he was offering. It was not just marriage he proposed, but transformation, the chance for a federal agent to become a farmer, for a woman alone to become part of something larger than survival.